Thanks for being here. It's the last talk of the session, so I know that some of you might want to take a map nap, if you will. But yeah, I really appreciate you still staying here and listening to my talk. So my talk is To Trust or Not to Trust Maps. That is the question. It's by William Shakespeare. Lesser known version. So before talking about this, I really think it's important to define what is trust, because trust is a really nebulous concept that has a lot of different meanings within a particular discipline and even across different disciplines. And so there's a few cartography and also information visualization scholars that have tried to define trust. So some people call it the subjective certainty of a map, others call it the tendency to rely on a visualization, or Ian Millhouse talks about it in terms of believing what is shown on the map as reality. And so thinking about these different definitions and also linking in some really common threads for what people have called trust and conceptualized trust as, I propose this definition of trust as the willingness to rely on geospatial information that's interpreted from a map with the expectation that the information has been ethically and accurately represented by a cartographer. And this is an evolving definition that is going to continue to evolve as I work through this through my dissertation. And I also hope that people come up to me and also continue to refine this definition, because obviously the more perspectives on this, and like getting Nat's perspective also has been really helpful throughout this. And so one of the long-standing assumptions in cartography or contentions is that people trust maps, and people trust maps more than other pieces of information. And so there's a scholar named Boggs that coined this as cartohypnosis. So there's this tendency to blindly trust maps. And for those of you who are the fans of The Office, we've seen, if you know the episode where Michael Scott just drives into a lake, this is a prime example of people blindly trusting maps. But we see this in real life, though, where people have to put up signage to ignore the GPS directions, because the GPS directions will lead you astray. But this is really indicative of people trusting maps. But it's also problematic to trust maps, because some maps have been used for evil, if you will, or maps have a long history of being used as propaganda tools. And so in the past, we can see examples of, oh boy, hopefully I don't have this again, France exaggerating their territories. And then in the present, we've seen this with the COVID-19 pandemic, where this map, let's see here.
I have a rule: when something has snafu in the Make everyone outside of this room jealous that we're not missing out on something cool.
So this map on the right is showing two different maps of Georgia showing COVID-19 cases. And the person that made this map made these maps changed the different class breaks in the map. And so it's misleading in that there's actually been an increase in COVID-19 cases, but they're hiding that in the classes. And so today, maps are increasingly being used to spread misinformation, and this is really being exacerbated by post-truth politics, where there's this abundance of misleading, often false information in the news. And this is also being exacerbated by the current technology landscape, where we can really rampantly share things and maps become viral really, really quickly. And so to address all this, there actually has been a lot of literature on trust in maps and also trust in visualizations. And so you can see here, since 2005, there's been 32, well, at least what I was able to find, 32 different empirical studies on trust. And by empirical, if you're not a nerdy PhD student like me, I mean studies that are actually using observations and measurements to measure people's trust. And so there is this really large body of work, but no one has really tried to tackle it all and make sense of all of it. So what is our comprehensive understanding of trust in maps or trust in visualizations? And so with this, I set out with doing a literature review to try to really understand what is this current state of science on trust in maps. And so the review is organized into over four major goals, and the rest of the presentation is also reflecting these goals. So I wanted to assess how has trust been empirically studied. And so what I mean by that is, what are the kinds of research designs that people have used, and also how have people actually measured trust? And then also a big thing is synthesizing the results of empirical work. So what are the common threads? What are the findings that we know right now that research has demonstrated? And then with this, identifying gaps in the existing research, because identifying these gaps will allow us to figure out, okay, what do we know and what do we need to know So figuring out the research questions that will guide the next step in this research push for trust in cartography. So I'll begin by talking about how has trust been studied. So in terms of research design, most of the experiments were quantitative, so they were using experiments. So researchers had like control group, treatment group, and then had a set of conditions that were exposing different participants to different conditions. And so that's the quantitative aspect. But there were also some qualitative approaches, so there was uses of surveys and interviews, but most of the research experiments were quantitative. And I think the most interesting thing is how have people actually measured trust, because again, trust is this really hard to pin down concept. I mean, it's really obvious, like if I trust Nat or if I trust Jake, it's really obvious. I know that, but as a researcher, how do we actually figure that out? It's really challenging. So most of the measures are in two different groups. So self-reporting. So for self-reporting, participants disclose their own perceptions or feelings or attitudes or beliefs. And so if we have this map here, it's a lovely map showing the temperature in Arkansas. Shout out to Brad in the back. And so we can see it's a little chilly. And so if for self-reporting, if it was a self-reporting question, then we would say on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all and 5 is completely, how much do you trust maps? And so this is how most of the experiments actually measured trust. So they had a single question, and basically if the participant indicated on a Likert scale like this, 1 to 5, how much they trusted the map. But there are also decision-based measures, which are arguably a bit more objective, and so their participants completed tasks, or they made decisions that were thought to be indicative of trust. And so again, looking at this map, so an example of decision-based measure would be, based on the map provided, would you issue a frost warning for the city of Monticello? I think that's how you pronounce it. And so here it's projected, it's 31 degrees right now, which is, if you're familiar with Fahrenheit, 31 is under the temperature of freezing. And so if participants decided that they were indeed going to issue a frost warning for that city, then that would indicate that they trust the map. Whereas if they decided, no, I'm not actually going to issue a frost warning, then they're probably not trusting the information that the map is providing. So in terms of self-reporting, there's two major groups. There's single item self-reporting, which is exactly what it sounds like. So researchers have a single question or statement where they ask someone, do you trust this map? And so on the left side, this is a Likert type item. So they asked how much you trust this map, from not at all to extremely. And so that was the most common way that people asked or measure trust. And then visual analog scales were also used. So here you drag a slider to indicate your trust. And so from 0 to 100, with 0 being not at all trustworthy, 100 being trustworthy. And then there are also multiple items. And so here, this is basically taking multiple of those Likert type items and then combining them to create a trust index. So here we can see that the researchers measured trust based on participants' responses to, is the visualization accurate? Is it biased? Is it complete? Is it fair? Is it trustworthy? And then there's also these decision-based measures. And so one of the examples was that participants assumed the role of a fire department dispatcher. And so basically they were shown two different maps, and these two maps, A and B, are visualizing the amount of information that's being presented. And based on which map they chose to use for the particular task, then that was indicative of trust. So if they chose one map over the other, then they trusted the one map more. Another one of these measures was borrowing from economics, behavioral game theory. And so basically participants were given a hypothetical amount of money, and then they were asked to invest the money in the visualization, or in this case in the companies. And so if you invested more money or all of the money into one of the visualizations, that's indicative of more trust. And these decision-based measures were used a lot fewer experiments than the self-reporting measures. So now pivoting to what have the studies actually found. And so I read all 32 papers, probably at least 3 times each, and it was really exhausting. But by the end of it, then it was really clear what were the major categories of results. And so I identified each of these themes based on if this was a cross-cutting thing across multiple different papers. Multiple papers had results related to this. So the themes were source, metadata, transparency, uncertainty, design, and modality. And so for the sake of time, I'll just go into each one of these, trying to give you like the cliff notes of of what the major results were for each of these. So most of the research suggests that authoritative, unbiased sources enhance trust. So if a map is made by something like MIT or a US government organization, then it's believed to enhance trust. Whereas if it's made by something like Fox News or Huffington Post, which are on different sides of the political spectrum, then it's probably not going to be super trustworthy. A big limitation here is that a lot of this research was pre-2016, which is really when the political polarization in the US really just went in a completely, really intensified. And so I think we need additional research on this to see how political ideology moderates these different relationships. As for metadata, this is kind of what Jake was talking about in terms of journalists actually disclosing where they got the data, what they did with the data, and so this was found to actually promote trust. And so if you include metadata, particularly where the data came from, this will foster trust in maps. So transparency, there's some researchers, Shang et al., that define transparency not in terms of the visual variable, in terms of opacity or if something's opaque or not, but rather the amount of information and the clarity of information. And so they hypothesize this curvilinear relationship where there's this sweet spot where people want enough information to get the gist of the story and to feel like they have a complete understanding of it, but they don't want too much because then it'll confuse them or they'll feel distracted. And then thereby that will decrease trust. And so in terms of how much information we should present in the maps, it should be just enough to give the reader a feel for the topic, but not too much. And so uncertainty, all maps have some level of uncertainty in them, and they're all abstractions of reality. And so most of the studies point to visualizing maps that visualize uncertainty actually improving trust, but only if the level of uncertainty is low. And so this map on the right here has a lot of uncertain enumeration units, and so that probably wouldn't be trusted because the data quality seems like it's poor. Whereas on the middle one, there's some uncertainty, which is good. The reader is like, okay, good, they're disclosing this information, they're being transparent to me. And that will foster trust. Another facet of this is design, and so it's been shown that beautiful and professional looking maps bolster trust. And so beautiful was defined in terms of using saturated, vivid colors, making readable legends, and also I think that also they omitted some of the countries in here, but you can't really see in the scale here. And also professional looking, so including things like different metadata as well, so there's some overlap here. And then finally, the question that I alluded to in the very beginning, whether or not maps are more trustworthy, it's not certain yet whether or not maps are more trustworthy than other types of information. There's really, some papers found that maps were more trustworthy, and then others actually found that text is more trustworthy or pictures were more trustworthy. So that's what's been done, and so I wanted to figure out, okay, what should researchers think about, and what should we do next? And so here I present a set of research challenges. These are longer term, and they really transcend a single project, and they're based off a lot of the methodological limitations of studies that have been done. And so it's really important to explicate trust in maps. So define really what is trust, and really in the context of cartography, is trust unique in terms of maps and trusting maps? Is it different than interpersonal trust, institutional trust? And if it is unique, we need unique measurements to actually capture trust in maps. And so we need to develop robust measures that can consistently and reliably measure trust. Most of the experiments that I looked at didn't conduct experiments that mirrored a typical map consumption environment. So maps are increasingly being read on mobile devices, online, and also we have this tendency to really heuristically process information. So not really critically process maps, especially when you're scrolling through social media or something like that. And so really making sure that experiments are replicating these conditions is really important to figuring out if the results will actually be applicable. A lot of the studies use things like an Amazon Mechanical Turk, and so the demographic of people that were being surveyed were really skewed towards folks who are generally more educated, who are generally white, also mostly just surveying people in the US. And so we also need to engage underrepresented groups in future research. And also practicing stimulus sampling. So this means not just testing one different map, because maps have a variety of different patterns, different locations, different scales. And so we need to systematically control for these things, but also include variation in these things to see if, like, okay, uncertainty might, if presenting uncertainty might boost trust in like a climate map, but what about an election map? And then we also need to control for individual differences. So people's prior beliefs, people's political ideology, things like that. And then finally, I'll touch on some research opportunities. So these are just some short-term research questions that I think would be good to ask. And so how do social media factors like captions affect trust? Most of the time when maps are shared on things like Twitter, or if you want to call it X, I guess. No. A lot of times people will take the map that's made by like Washington Post or USGS, and then they'll have their own spin on it, and so then they'll have their own textual interpretation. So does that affect people's trust? Also, which dimensions of metadata besides the source of the data affect trust? Does visual hierarchy affect trust? And so I talked a little bit about transparency in terms of the amount of information and the clarity. And so a lot of the time, visual hierarchy really helps establish that clarity. So how can we look into that? The experiments actually that I found on visualizing uncertainty were all on non-map visualizations. And so we really need to have specific work in cartography that looks into how visualizing uncertainty affects trust in maps. And then there were some studies, again, that hinted at professional looking maps bolster trust, but they didn't test individual design techniques. And so does the presence of a legend boost trust? Does the level of generation affect trust? Generalization affect trust. And then finally, it's still not clear, are maps more trustworthy than text and other types of information? And with that, that's all I have. Any questions? Yuha.
Thank you, Tim. It's really a very interesting presentation. So I have some questions regarding, because you list several different themes of the trust. So is it possible that we can have some quantitative analysis to understand, to separate these different types of trust? For example, one map make people feel not trusted because it is from a data source rather than it is from its visualization. Well, another map, it might be because its visualization, it cause people feel cannot trust it, but not because of the data source. So is there any way that we can separate these different things and analyze what factors that contribute
Sure.
to the degree to the trust?
Yeah, so the question was, I presented these, I think 6 or 7 themes that I found in the literature of things that might affect trust, and can we figure out based on, can we tease out which one of these is actually driving the trust for a particular map? Is that the question? Yeah. Yeah, so I think when we're researching this, it's really important to have like a single independent variable. So if you're interested in uncertainty, like you need to probably just test for uncertainty, or maybe 2, and do a factorial design where you're looking at the interactions between the 2. But I think it is really hard to, if you're doing this in a non-research setting, I think it's really hard to tease out which things might actually be affecting the trust. But I think systematically controlling for these different variables, I think, is really crucial in the research. Yeah, back there. Oh, yeah, you. Sorry.
So first of all, I love this paper and this project. So
Thank you.
I'd like to see where you go. Excited to see it. I just had a couple of thoughts with these questions, and some of them I feel like you've partially spoken to. I was sort of thinking about, I've been talking to a lot of people this week about like the goals and purposes of a map. And for example, I'm thinking of some of the maps on our show. One of them showing beautiful areas hand-drawn across the world. I don't know who it is, I'm sorry. But I'm thinking, if I think about that map, what is trust in that context?
Yeah.
As opposed to trust in, I saw another map also beautifully done, hiking trails in Oregon, very different purpose. What would trust mean based on what that map is for?
Absolutely.
So, like, I just like, not all maps are intended to be accurate in the sense of,
Yep.
Right? So, I'm also thinking of different contexts and sort of cultural or geographical context. I don't know if anyone here has been to Venezuela. It will not be, it does not work in the same scale in the ways that we are used to in the United States. Cultural context where trust and authority, and thinking of, for example, Russia, at least like years ago, like they have a very different relationship with government and authorities. And so there might be a very different relationship to the sources and what they're doing. And so, I have a feeling that's just a gap in your literature probably because so many of our studies, like you say, are from the U.S.
Yep, absolutely.
But I'm curious about how that plays out.
Yeah. So quick summary. The question was, first of all, some maps like Anton's map, obviously trusting that means something very different than seeing a map showing COVID-19 cases on Johns Hopkins. Yeah, that's one of the things I'm wrangling with trying to figure out a definition that's all-inclusive and really can cover everything. I think that any definition is going to have its limitations. I think what I'm working on is very much more towards, I guess, maps that try to present facts and truth. Obviously, there's always going to be partial truth in maps, and so I'm really trying to. I think my work is really focusing on that. And it's motivated by this growth and misinformation, and so that's where I'm staking my claim. I think that there's definitely someone else. I think that's a whole other project though on trust in like more artistic maps, I guess, if you will. Second part. The question was, what about, it seems like a lot of the studies have been in America. What about, in Venezuela or like Russia? There's different associations with maps in terms of authority. And so, yeah, one of the things that comes up a lot in the literature is that in the States, we've had this historical authority that's been imbued in maps because of the gatekeeping process, because originally there were only a handful of different organizations that were making maps. And so I think that it would be really valuable. That goes in most research in cartography as a whole to get additional research that's outside of America and to get those different perspectives. But yeah, that's most of the papers were Eurocentric or American centric. Yeah. Question. I'll take more applause.
So the maps that you decide to interview or study or investigate,
Yeah.
they have to, apparently, it seems like they have to meet a certain level of criteria for you to include in your analysis. What about those sort of like counter mapping projects, those sort of subversive mapping projects?
Sure.
Including those, do you have a rubric for that?
Yeah. So I should clarify right now, and sometimes it's not clear with my presentation, that I'm not, this wasn't analysis, this was not an analysis of specific maps. I was looking at a set of research papers and looking at the findings from those. So I wasn't looking at specific maps and analyzing like the trustworthiness of specific maps. But yeah, so your question was, what about, if you're analyzing a set of maps, like what about subversive maps? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing in terms of that what is trust there, because again, like if my definition is trying to get at some level of truth, but those subversive maps really are trying to fight back at this typical universal truth that maps portray and showing a different type of knowledge. And so yeah, I don't have a super great answer for that right now. I think it's something to think about some more. And yeah, do you have a question?
We can talk later.
Okay. I mean, there might be time. I don't know.
So actually, because Aileen had to, I'll get on this microphone
Sure.
real quick. Aileen is obviously not here. We miss her very much. But because of that, we can have more time for questions. This is all lends to very interesting discussions. We do have the room for a few more minutes. So more questions for Tim, or all the presenters are still here, or we can go have some extra time in the lobby and catch up there. But yeah.
Yeah, do you want to ask your question? Yeah, go for it.
It's not actually a question, but it's basically connected to what you all just said. So just breaking the elements of different maps. Is it like I remember that Building House did similar analysis that they did a content analysis, coding different data manipulations and graph manipulations, and grouped into 4 different types of like persuasive mapping.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if we cluster those elements together and do a user study, whether we can figure out
Sure.
like what types of elements like derive this trust or mistrust of the
Yeah. Yeah, I think a really interesting experiment, I just realized that I don't have captions, so I apologize for anyone who need them. I think a really interesting experiment in that vein would be to, give participants a set of maps and then have them, note the criteria that they're using to ascertain the trustworthiness of them. And so provide the rationale. So like, if they have a map, they might say that I trust this because of the source, or I trust this because of the colors, it's appealing, or it looks professional. And so I think that would be an interesting approach. Yeah. Kind of like a reverse content analysis in a way, where you're like having the participants provide the information instead of dissecting it yourself. Yeah, thank you. Any other last questions? Cool, thank you.